Finance series by Sipping Thoughts in association with Salt. So today in this series, it's the second episode of our finance series with when we came together with Salt, and today we are discussing very important and interesting topic, investing and saving. There's a taboo about this investing thing, like personally I am very afraid of investing, and I know a lot of people who are really afraid of investing, and they're like, we will get into losses and stuff like that. So that is what we are going to discuss today. And Sipping Thoughts has this vision of empowering women. Like, we always want to empower women, and I feel one of the best ways to empower women is to make them financially independent and to help them financially. And so we came across this amazing platform, Salt, and we partnered with them, and this is what we have come with. So I'll quickly move on to introducing you to today's panelist. This is a finance masterclass about saving and investing. So today I have a very interesting panel with me. First of all, I have a very beautiful Aditi Sholapurkar. Aditi is the co-founder of Salt. A tarot card reader once told her that she'd waste her life if she worked anything other than money, and looks like that came true. She did everything from her early stage in fintech investing at Goldman Sachs, equities and FX at Bamble, and Citi. She helped to build a bank at Paytm, and you'd think her views on money would have shaped her by the years of experience working with it, but you're wrong. So yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Next up we have Astha Shukla with us. Hi Astha. She is a part of the founding team of Salt. She studied bioengineering in college, but was disillusioned with it before graduation. She wasn't sure what she wanted to do, but knew that she wanted to stay away from finance since she intimidated her to no end. But logically, she ended up in spending nearly half decade in VC straight out of the college, followed by jumping straight into the role at Salt. So that's about her. Hi, Astha. So, without wasting any more time, I'll quickly hand it over to both of you to take this session forward. Also, before moving ahead, I would like to tell this to everyone that this is a very interesting session and interactive also. So you can, put everything in the chats, and you can even switch on your cameras, and we'll unmute you for your questions at the end of the session. So, yeah, that's it. Over to you, Astha.
Thanks, Harshita. So yeah, I think like Harshita said, right, as we thought about how we wanted to do this masterclass, we really felt that we did not want this to be a class, right? Like, we didn't want to have this be a teaching where we're telling you what to do with your money. We wanted it to be more organic. And something that we believe at Salt is that money should flow into your life, like conversations with a friend. And hence, we wanted this to be like a conversation. So we won't be, pulling up a deck and teaching you what to do and how to invest your money and where to put it. Instead, we're just going to have a conversation, Aditi and I. And the reason we're doing that is that, both of us had the exact questions that we will be talking about today when we were learning to navigate saving and investing. And personally, for me, sometimes I didn't have access to conversations, right? Sometimes I felt intimidated to talk to other people about it. And I had questions, but nowhere to go to have those questions answered. And so that's really what we're hoping to recreate here, is a space for you to talk to us like you would with a friend. So don't wait till the end, right? Like, don't wait till the end to ask us questions. Jump in the middle. Tell us what you want us to talk about in the chat. And if it's okay with you, come up and ask the question yourself. Turn on your video, talk to us, because we want to talk to you like, we hoped someone would have talked to us when we were doing all of this, but unfortunately we didn't have that. So yeah, that's what we want to recreate. So yeah, I guess let's dive right in. Aditi, I guess I'll start by asking you something that when I was starting out was difficult for me, right? So initially, when I was like, first job, I felt like, okay, I have my entire life ahead of me to start investing. Why should I do it now? It feels like I can do it at any point in time. Right now, I should be spending and enjoying the money that I do have. And on the flip side, when I would talk to my mom, who's, now above 50 years old, she feels that maybe it's too late for her to start. Maybe there's no point anymore because, she doesn't have a retired life ahead of her. So what's the point, right? So I guess there's two questions here, which is that, is there a right time to start? And if so, even if you find that right time, like, why start? Why start now? Like, why invest at all? Why not just let your money sit in a bank account, use it and spend it on the stuff you love? Like, tell me what you think about that.
Got it. No, very interesting. And before I get into that, just hello everyone. Thank you so much for giving us this time. It's literally the most valuable thing you can give someone. So we're very very appreciative that you're all here. I'm just going to reiterate the request that if you don't mind, we would love to have your videos on, simply because the session is meant to be interactive, and like it would really help Astha and me if we could literally like see your expressions, right? Because what if we're saying just does not resonate with you at all, and it's just like, then clearly we're doing something wrong. So it would be very much appreciated if you could do that. Thank you so much. I see that some of you are turning on your video, so really appreciate that. So great question, by the way. And I think it's that one thing that practically everyone that at least I've ever spoken to about investing, about saving, gets wrong. Because, well, yes, there is no one right answer, but there are a lot of wrong answers, right? And actually, let me start by giving you an example, my own example. So as Harshita introduced, my entire life has been in financial services, right? I started out as a trader. I used to be an equities trader, then I was an FX trader, then I was a fintech investor. So, I mean, that's as hardcore, heavy duty finance as it gets. And so, well, theoretically, I had like all the possible knowledge and resources, and technically even the people around me, right? Like the conversations that Astha was referring to, that a lot of people don't have access to. I was surrounded by those conversations 24/7. I was having them with my clients, my peers were having them with each other. And I went through that exact same journey. So for the first 5 years of, being in those jobs, my thought process was exactly like this. I'm so overwhelmed right now, right? Like my day job takes just everything out of me. I don't have time to sit and do this. And I still remember as like a 20-something-year-old, my dad would actually tell me, like, he would say, "Beta, FD to kar lo." For those that don't understand Hindi, he was like, at least put your money in an FD, right? Like it's just lying there in your savings account. And honestly, I just didn't have like the mental or emotional bandwidth to even think about it. And I'm pretty sure, because hindsight is always 2020. A big reason why I didn't have the bandwidth to do anything about it was because I practically knew everything. I knew all the things that could go right, could go wrong. And so in my head, it just became this massive like overload of information and decisions. And I was just like, okay, I cannot deal with this right now. You know what? I'm young. I can start anytime. I can do whatever. And you know what? Like any time never comes, right? And in fact, I remember that at one point, maybe it was towards the end, I think I was thinking of transitioning out of investment banking into fintech. And so I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll be less overwhelmed now. And I remember having a casual conversation with a colleague who was a trader. He just proposed to his fiance and he showed me a picture of the ring. And he's like, you know what, my investments paid for this ring. I was like, that's amazing, because it was a pretty huge ring. And I was like, maybe I should do that. And he's like, oh, you know what? No point now. The rally is over. Can you believe it? Like someone tells you that they have, the good intention to start now. And the person tells you, oh, you know what? No point. Like the rally is over. What he meant was that, markets did so well in like the last year that I should have done it then. And there's no point in doing it now. And I, with all of my knowledge and all of just everything that I had, was like, oh yeah, that's true. The rally's over. There's no point doing it. Now when I look back and I just calculate, like, if I had just started that day, if I had just not listened to him, if I had not been convinced that the rally's over, yeah, that would have been a good decision. But no, the point of this story is that there isn't ever a perfect time to start, and the world is full of wrong information and people who, well, don't have the right information but sound really confident, telling you that, oh, you know what, now's not the right time. Wait for like XYZ thing to happen, right? And specifically, I think when it comes to like age, because age is not an absolute, right? There's so many things that are more related to stage of life. So, for example, let's say even someone in their 30s, right, could have a very different life situation, or someone in their 40s could have a very different life situation. You might be absolutely free of all liabilities, or you might be just, you just might not have bandwidth for those things, right? So like my parents, for example, never invested. They saved their money really well. They made really responsible decisions, but investing was just something that they weren't just interested in, right? And that was fine, because it wasn't born out of a place of fear and, oh my God, I don't know what to do, or I don't know when to start. It was a very conscious decision that, like, we love FDs and we know how to save our money, and, we bought a house and we're sorted, and we want to give our kid the best possible life. And it was just, I think 2 years back when my dad retired, that I said, okay, you know what, you have nothing to lose now. Why don't you start? And he did start, and he did enjoy that process. So, I mean, the short answer is the right time is any time that you want to start. And in fact, way more important than the time of starting is a little bit of your method and some amount of discipline. And we'll talk more about, what that method is and what that discipline means. Those are the things that are important. And those are the things that you should worry about.
It's really interesting that you said that you had all of this information and you felt overwhelmed by it, because I feel like I had the opposite journey where I wanted to have all the information before I started, right? I felt that just a little bit of knowledge about this one little thing, which is mutual funds, is not enough. I must know about stocks and crypto and everything under the sun before I can start investing. And I think I've seen a lot of my friends also struggle with this. So, like, what do you think about that? Do you need to know everything before you start, or can you just start somewhere?
I feel like I'm one of those people who is very uniquely qualified to tell you that that is not true. Like I said, right, very often it's just a massive liability. So like I'll give you, in my profession, because it was literally my job to do this, right? It was literally my job to follow markets, to follow all asset classes, to talk to clients about this stuff all the time, to know, like, monetary policy of like different regulators around the world and how that might affect everything. And I even knew the dynamics of the market, right? So most people like you and me, for example, think of investing as, oh, it's something that I'm doing, right? That's the context in which you think of it. Because of my job, I had like a 30,000 feet view of it. So I knew that, like, there's these investment banks, and then there are these big things called institutional investors and their funds, and, this is how market manipulation happens. And I knew, like, I knew stuff by heart that, like, most people wouldn't even find on Google. And all that did for me was just paralyze me, right? So I was so good at, I guess, giving advice or taking actions on behalf of my clients. But when it came to myself, I was just paralyzed by all of this information. And at the same time, I had friends, people, colleagues or just people that I'd studied with that actually didn't have access to all of that information. Yes, they used a few basic important things. Like, a few things do matter, right? Knowing a few things is really, really important. And those are mostly things related to yourself, to be honest. And, we'll talk more about that, who just started, right? Like, sometimes they say, well, ignorance is bliss. In this scenario, ignorance is definitely not bliss. You do need a certain amount of information, but just, you don't need to know everything. In fact, you should not know everything. It really doesn't help. And then in the long term, like, because everyone has, especially Twitter nowadays, is so full of stories of people being like, oh, and if in this year you had bought a stock of XYZ car instead of buying a car, like, you would have been here. I'm like, yeah, that's just such rubbish, because you needed a car, right? You couldn't like gone to office in a stock. But really, like, the right answer, I think, for most people is so much more to do with information about yourself. Like, what's your life situation? How much money do you have? Just basic understanding of some of these things, and honestly, you're good to go.
That's interesting, because maybe something I want to touch upon here is that I recently, actually about a year ago, I got added to this investing group, right? And there were a bunch of people in this group, and they are talking like really confidently about, let's pump HDFC stock, and, let's do all these things. And I was like, what are these words? Like, what is pumping a stock? I've never invested in a stock. And luckily I happen to know the people in that group, okay, and I know them enough to know that they have no clue what they're talking about. Like they have never even saved a penny in their life, and all of a sudden they're jumping to stock investing. And like I realized in that moment that, of course, fine, I didn't need to know everything, but there's also a type of person who has the confidence that they can project about knowing things, but I was not that person, right? So like for you, how much of this is just about the confidence to feel okay with what you do know? Because I think something for me is that has been tough is if I don't know everything, I don't feel confident enough to act on it at all. And hence my paralysis was the opposite of yours, where I didn't know enough. So I was paralyzed and I was like, I'm not going to do anything until I know everything. So yeah, like how much of that is about confidence, according to you?
I mean, like I can't stress enough like what a massive like problem this is. And I keep thinking back, because like when you're in school, like literally like school, uh, we all have been through this, right? Like, let's say you have an exam coming up. There's a type of kid who's, let's say, halfway through the syllabus, and you feel really confident. You're like, I'm so good, right? Like, yeah, I'm getting there. And there's another type of kid that's exactly halfway through the syllabus who's like, oh my God, like there's so much left, right? I think it in the real world that happens all the time, and specifically when it comes to money and investing, right? Like, for example, the person who told me, oh yeah, the rally's over, he said it with so much confidence. He said it like he was God and that he could look into the future and know that, you know what, nothing, no appreciation whatsoever was going to happen after this point. And it was just because of that. It's not that there was any difference in our knowledge level. It was just that he was like, oh yeah, that's done. And I was like, oh yeah, that must be done, right? And it's a massive, like, if there's one thing I could just request people to do, and I'm seeing some questions and like, how much exactly do you need to know, or how do teenagers start, or if I don't know anything about this, how can I start? My first tip to you is you have to learn to tune out more people than you have to learn to listen to. Like that is the rule of thumb. Okay, 90% of your friends, people on Twitter, like like Twitter bros giving, I mean bros, I use that term loosely, just people giving, just please tune it out. Okay, it's a really simple framework. And maybe this is a good segue into what I wanted to talk about is how that framework matters more, right? How that method and discipline of investing matters more. So very simply, if you're just starting, right, there are a few questions you need to ask yourself. For example, how much money and time can you give this? When I say how much money, and these things sound like no-brainers, but trust me, they're important. When I say how much money you can give this, if you're just starting, right, I would not recommend that you take like 50% of your savings and just toss them into like a stock or a mutual fund. It's so important. What happens is because so much FOMO builds up, right? Like you almost overcorrect. So you didn't do anything for so many years. Your money's lying in your savings bank account, and there are enough people telling you that, oh my God, your money is just rotting if it's lying there in your savings account, and you feel all of this like pent up guilt. And so then you almost overcorrect and you're like, let's do this, right? And most people at that time succumb to like taking these rash actions where you take like a big chunk of your savings and you throw it into a stock or a mutual fund or a whatever the nearest person that you had access to told you. And then obviously, right, like ups and downs happen. Sometimes in the normal course of life, ups and downs happen. Markets move, interest rates change. Sometimes things like COVID happen, where in 1 month, 25% of just market value is wiped off, right? And that's where you panic because you weren't mentally ready for this and you bit off way more than you can chew. And then 9 out of 10 times, people panic and take another wrong step where they're like, okay, I'm screwed. I don't know this. I need to get out, right? And that's just, it's easy to prevent that by forcing yourself, almost having the discipline to start small, start slow, right? It's not, I mean, it's not a rule of thumb, but start with like, I don't know, 5% or less. Just there is a huge learning curve here, right? Like there is with anything, with driving, with cooking. When you start learning how to cook, the first thing you don't invite like 10 people to a dinner party and decide to make a 6-course meal, right? Like you start slow, you start with the basics. Please start like that. The second part of what I said is how much money and time are you willing to give this? I don't mean time in terms of how long can you stay invested for. That's actually a much more, it's a way bigger thing, and we'll come to it later. When I say time, I mean a lot of people, for example, who invest in stocks, specifically, right, feel like they burnt their fingers because inherently, like you're just putting, let's say, that much more money into a single thing, right, or a few things, which means that yes, either you have the zen to just like forget about it, which again, let's be honest, most people who are starting out and not really familiar with this might not have, right? And so if you're not going to be that person that's going to be able to invest a lot of time every day in like researching, reading news, so on and so forth, it might not be the best place to start, right? For example, I over time, right, have become really, really good at managing my money, like really good. I'm sure I can't pay any advisor anywhere in the world to manage my money better than I do. But I spend a lot of time also every day. I spend at least half an hour just reading up on things that will help me on my investment, and I enjoy it, so I do it, right? But I'm confident that like 90% of the people on this call don't want to do that. So choosing what to invest in is a big function of how much time you're literally willing to give that activity, and that's probably why things like, for example, mutual funds are popular because that's I want to say like that's a lower maintenance activity, right? And again, I'm not saying that that applies for everyone. A lot of people, for example, find it much easier to just like, oh my, I understand the retail space really well. For example, I understand FMCG really well, and I know these like 2 or 3 companies, and I'm just so comfortable I can blindly put my money and forget, right? Like I have a colleague who I think put just a big chunk of like his life savings into like Bata, and he was okay with it because he was just that familiar with it. So it's not a one size fits all rule, but I mean that is an important thing to take care of. I've already spoken about life stage. Like life stage is important, right? Not age or any of those things, but just where you are in your life. You could be a young student, first salary, no liabilities, or you could be someone that, let's say, has to pay off a student loan. Those things matter, right? For example, I would never tell anyone to go into debt so that they can invest, right? Like at least if you're starting out, don't do things like that. And again, and this is something that this is the last point and most important is like why, and this is something that COVID has taught us, to be honest, you have to always keep in mind a little bit that unforeseen things can happen, right? What I mean by that is, sure, like I said, a lot of ups and downs will happen in the course of your life, in the course of your investing journey, but like sometimes big events can happen, right? Like last year, COVID, apart from the fact that so much happened in markets and there was so much correction, it was just a really big life event for a lot of people, right? You might have actually needed to like you just might have needed a lot of liquid money. Like I did that. I liquidated half of my investments because my parents were in India and I was nervous and so on and so forth, right? So just keeping that in mind somewhere, that these things happen, that's a broad framework, and that is fairly important.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think going off of that, someone on the chat, I think Mukul had a question saying like,
Okay.
Is there a good rule of thumb on how to apportion your savings, right? And you touched upon this right now a little bit, like how do I think about liquidity versus, money that I just want growing maybe versus YOLO money, which can, it's okay if I just don't touch it for many years. Is there some tips you can think of before you even start investing, like specific things that or ways in which you can apportion savings?
Okay, got it. So yeah, look, eventually, right, like let's say a year from now, you're all going to come up with your own framework for this. When I was starting out, and because I had literally no other framework, a friend actually told me something really funny. He's like, oh, whatever age you are, that percentage of your money should be in risky stuff and everything else should be liquid. That is by no means scientific, okay? But whatever, at that time it worked for me. So like I was 25 and I was like, okay, that's easy. So 25% of my money, I can just like invest. I can maybe invest it in stocks. I can invest it in like equity, mutual funds, so on and so forth. 75% of it needs to be safe. And well, because I had, really no other science to apply to it, I decided to split that down the middle. So I was like, okay, half of that 75% is always going to be in my bank account or in an FD, and I'm not going to touch it. And the other half, I'm going to put in what I thought were more safe or more stable instruments, right? So for example, I invested in a few debt mutual funds, right? Now, obviously, over time, as I got more comfortable with this process and it became a little bit more of muscle memory, that changed. So for example, today, because I'm super comfortable with, and I honestly, I'm also super comfortable with taking losses and taking a little bit more risk, so on and so forth. Basically, my journey has evolved. I've changed a little bit. I have well, I don't know, 10% of my money liquid, which a lot of people find really scary and really alarming, right? And so I guess, like I said, right, to start with, if you're just starting today, I would in any case not tell you to start with more than 5 to 10% of your money, but don't feel scared to tweak that amount and, change it according to your needs and how your knowledge grows, right? So for example, let's say you're living in an expensive city, right? You're living in an expensive city and your salary comes in. You always know that, okay, there's a certain percentage of my money that literally just goes into living expenses, rent, so on and so forth, right? Hypothetically, let's say that's 50% of your money or 60% of your money, and then you have roughly 40% left, right? Just try to split that, I don't know, 1:4, right? Try to invest or do something with a fourth of that money or less than that, and just keep the rest. And slowly you'll ramp that up. That amount will grow, and you'll be fine.
Got it. So when you're saying 25% of your money and 75% of your money, you mean disposable income after all your usual stuff rent and stuff has been taken care of, right?
Of course. Fair. Yeah, goes without saying. Life is not less important than investing. Let me just reiterate that.
Yeah. And another thing that came up when you were just talking, and funnily I get asked this a lot every time I download any investment app, is what is your risk appetite, right? So you said risk and high risk versus low risk, right? How do I know how to answer that? I have no idea of how to answer this question of what is your risk appetite. Just maybe tell me how you think about that.
No, I think that's a really valid question. So it's not a wrong thing to ask, okay? It's just, I think it's asked to people in not great ways without explaining to you what it really means. The way I think about it is it's very simple. It's what will give you sleepless nights, right? So again, let's take the example of that person that's just starting to invest. So far, all of your money has probably been in a savings account. Maybe some of it was in an FD. So you are not even familiar with the concept of losing money, right? It hasn't yet happened to you that you put 10,000 rupees in a bank and you got back 5,000. So chances are that tomorrow, if you were to invest in a stock or a mutual fund, and let's say you invested 10,000 and something happened, right? Market tanked, or there was a short-term event or anything like that, and you see that value of that 10,000 has become 9,000. Trust me when I say this, you're going to panic a little bit, right? And again, these things have happened to me, and like I said, right, with my background, ideally they shouldn't have. So risk appetite is a very personal thing, and it changes so much during the course of your life, not even decade to decade, right? Year to year. So when you're starting out, just the concept of, oh my God, we can actually lose money is new to a lot of people. And that's why, I think I saw someone in the chat asking, what are these stable instruments that you mentioned? So a lot of people, when they start investing, for example, and again, this is something that I did, so I tell people that, you might do that, is, for example, instead of jumping straight into stocks or equity mutual funds, or, riskier kind of funds, and we'll talk about that, maybe start with, let's say, debt mutual funds, right? And we'll go into what is debt, what is equity, or maybe start with things which are very easy to liquidate, in the sense that, again, let's take that stock example. You put 10,000 in a stock. Now something bad happened and the value became 9,000. And let's say you panic or you need that money or whatever, you actually have to withdraw all of that money, which means your loss is actually becoming real, right? So far, it was just a paper loss. It was a -1,000 that, let's say, you were seeing on your app or your screen. But the moment you withdraw that money, you've realized that loss, which means it's actually become real, which means that you have actually lost, and you have actually lost thousands, right? And that's true for anything that's related to stocks and equities. But a lot of time, debt, and to put it very simply, that means lending money to someone, right? Technically, for example, when you're putting your money in a bank, whether it's in an FD, whether it's in a savings account, the bank in their books also thinks of it as you having lent them money because it's your money that you're putting with them. But obviously, like more form, like, and you guys would have heard these terms, right? You would have heard terms like bonds or debt mutual funds or liquid funds or overnight funds or short-term funds, low duration funds. Forget the jargon. All of these are basically debt funds. What this means is that someone, let's say a government or a large company, decided that they needed money to grow. So they issued this thing called a bond, which means that, hey, Astha, I would really like to grow my company. I'm a really stable company. I have a really high rating and, really good track record of like, servicing my debts well. If you give me 1,000 now, 3 years later, I'll give you like, I don't know, 1,000 and some extra money, right? Which would be the interest. And then what people do is that they take a bunch of these kind of instruments and put them in mutual funds. So what that actually means is in this scenario, let's say, Astha would have only got her money back after 3 years because that's how bonds work, or let's say 1 year or whatever. The moment it becomes a mutual fund, life becomes easy. And we don't need to get into that technicality now, but it becomes a lot more liquid, as in you could invest into that mutual fund today, and 6 months later or 3 months later or whenever you want, you could take it out. Of course, there sometimes could be like small penalties. For debt funds, they're usually very low. So like only in, less than a month or less than a year. But the point is, it's easier to start out with, right? You're not putting your money in stocks where there could be crazy ups and downs. You're putting your money in high quality debt, which basically means that formula that we learned in school, right? Principal into interest rate into time, that applies. Your money will grow. And let's say for whatever reason, you need to take it out or you need to liquidate it. You're okay to do it, right? So that's a safer thing to start with. Someone also asked about digital gold, I think. Again, same response, right? Like gold obviously is an asset that people are really used to investing in and people feel familiar with. And traditionally, people have invested in gold by like literally buying, physical gold. And fortunately, nowadays you have things like digital gold. And in fact, and again, we don't have to get into all those details now. You actually have like funds and etc. that are based on gold. So yeah, digital gold could be just a great investment, right? More stable, less risky, easier to stomach, easier to start out with. So yeah.
Got it. So I'll try and summarize this for my own benefit and for everyone that's watching. Okay. You're saying that some of the most stable investments can potentially be comparative to equity, of course, debt, and then maybe gold. And equity overall is riskier in that risk profile that we were talking about, right? Is that fair to assume?
Yes, exactly. Okay. And in fact, I see a question from Rebecca where she's saying that, she as an older professional, no liabilities really. Her money used to be in, I think, bank deposits and FDs, but those rates are going lower. Where should she invest and how should she learn? First of all, like that's factually very, very true, right? For the last few years, interest rates have kind of been, on a downward journey, to put it mildly. So yes, in 2012, for example, if you would have put your money in an FD, you would have got like 8% easy. That's practically like impossible to come back nowadays, come across nowadays, right? And I think a very important purpose of investing, aside from just growing your money, is to not let the value of your money diminish, right? So what that means is every year we hear these words, right? That, inflation is like 6% or 7%. So what that means is, let's say today, if I had 100 rupees and something cost 100 rupees, a year from now, because inflation was 6%, and I'm using rough examples, that thing's going to be worth 106 rupees. So I'm going to need 106 rupees to buy the same thing. But if in this 1 year, my 100 rupees did not grow to 106 rupees, then my money really lost value. And I think a lot of times when you think about FDs and savings bank, that's people's biggest fear. So when people tell you your money is rotting when it's lying, it's not really rotting, but yes, it is losing value, right? And that's why investing becomes something that you should think of. So again, because this is a function of interest rates, and the same thing that affects FDs, unfortunately also affects bonds and debt funds, which I just spoke about. I at such times, like I would, for example, invest in equities, right? Or that's what I've seen, friends and family and colleagues do. That again, your life situation, etc., permitting, investing in equities or equity mutual funds is a good idea in this scenario, simply because, and I should caveat a few things, right? In general, even though there is a lot more like ups and downs when it comes to stocks and markets. And again, right now is a very weird time to be talking about this because like COVID was last year and that was crazy ups and downs. But like those things have happened before in human history, right? Over a really long period of time. And you could literally look at like any duration of time, equity markets tend to go up, right? So it becomes almost like a very easy thing to say that, oh, equities are better than any other asset class. And I think that's too simplistic. And like I said, right, you should always take things into account. Like, are you going to be really nervous if tomorrow you were to wake up and, you were to see minus 1,000? But all said and done, equities do become a good option in the scenario that Rebecca mentioned. And like I said, right, to start out with, just equity mutual funds. And even within equity mutual funds, like if you really want to, for example, play it safe, it's always easy to, for example, segregate, right? So this is going to sound like a lot of jargon, so bear with me. But you hear these terms like large cap, mid cap, small cap, all of these different words, right? Very simply, the way the equity mutual fund world is divided is that people think, what are like some really big companies, right? Like the biggest companies in the country, for example. Those effectively become like your large cap companies, right? Like an HDFC Bank is a large cap company. Infosys is a large cap company. Similarly, mid cap is like, whatever, like a middle level, and small cap is smaller companies. There's a lot of like technical distinction, but broadly that's what it means. Generally, people, and this has been sort of proved over time, that large cap companies grow well, right? And when things go bad, they suffer less than, let's say, smaller companies. And when things are going good, they might not give you as much return or as much gains as, let's say, if you're invested in mid-size or smaller size companies, right? So that's why, to start with, for example, when I started with large cap equity mutual funds because I was like, fine, peace of mind, right? And slowly, as you learn and you become more comfortable, then you could diversify into, let's say, mid cap or small cap or some mix and so on and so forth.
So, okay. So you're saying that, okay, overall in terms of asset classes, equity is highest in terms of risk. But even within equity, if you wanted to feel just a little bit more comfortable, large cap mutual funds or even stocks for that matter are a good place to start. Like if you want equity, you want that high risk, but you still want to keep it not crazy in terms of risk, you can start with large cap. Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think a question someone asked is, what are the channels of investing, right? And what are the commercials involved? So kind of like, what is the cost to me when I'm investing in different types of mutual funds and stuff like that? So maybe you can shed light on that, as well as, direct versus regular funds. Maybe, I know we're veering into mutual funds, but just a little bit of like different modes of investing and the costs involved to me as an investor.
Got it. No, that's a great question, right? So again, so that you can understand this well, let me step back and explain exactly like what a mutual fund is, who makes it, so on and so forth, right? So a mutual fund, and let's take equity mutual funds as an example, because that's easier to explain, is instead of a person investing in like, let's say, just HDFC Bank or just Infosys or all of these like individual stocks of companies, someone said, okay, let me mix all this up in a certain proportion, right? And make a fund out of it, right? So let's say if they pick the largest companies, it would become a large cap mutual fund. Or if they, let's say, picked only technology companies, it would become like a technology mutual fund. Now, the company that does this is basically the asset management company, the AMC. So for example, if you hear words like, for example, HDFC large cap mutual fund or Mirae large cap mutual fund, HDFC or Mirae are the asset management companies that have essentially created this fund, right? And typically what these companies do is assign fund managers to take care of these funds. So what that means is, like I said, right, you might have started out with a certain proportion of certain companies, right? But over time, depending on, let's say, things that happen in the market or just anything, you might want to change that, right? So, for example, let's say in general, banks aren't doing that great for whatever reason. The fund manager might decide, okay, maybe I reduce how much bank stock I have in this fund, and I maybe increase technology companies or whatever, right? Like a lot of research and whatnot goes into this. So that's really the process of your fund being managed, right? Now, all of these are available to you across a lot of different channels, right? So they're available to you on a lot of like tech platforms and apps, like the ones that you might hear about, right? So for example, I think when I started, I used to use something called Funds India, which was a distributor. And I'm also touching into like direct and regular, because they were a distributor. And I understand how difficult this is for like people to grasp, but just bear with me. Because they were a distributor, they essentially take like 1% out of your gains, right? And so after a while, I figured out, oh, there are ways I cannot go through a distributor, but in fact invest in direct plans, right? And then I think I switched to using Coin, or there are a lot of different apps which, let's say, gave me access to direct mutual funds. So that means I wasn't really giving away that 1% to a distributor, right? So these are all different channels. Honestly, a lot of banks have their own like a lot of banks also offer this. It isn't the smoothest digital experience most of the time, but there are all of these different channels available, right? For example, I know that a lot of people would feel more comfortable going to their bank relationship manager and being like, hey, can you help me invest in these 3-4 mutual funds? Even if it's not super digital, you might feel just psychologically better. Sure, go for it, do that. The important thing to know is that what are going to be your costs, etc., right? So two important costs, I think, to bear in mind when you think about investing in mutual funds. One is the expense ratio, or sometimes it's called total expense ratio, or sometimes you will just see an abbreviation, the ER or ER. That very simply means the cost of like doing all of this work and maintaining that fund. So everything that I described, right? Like a company makes it, a fund manager sits and decides how much to put in what, and they keep changing it from time to time, so on and so forth. The cost of doing that essentially is charged to whoever buys a mutual fund as a total expense ratio. It's a percentage. So sometimes you'll see that percentage being as high as 2% or 1%. That typically happens when those funds are really, really actively managed. Like a person is just really sitting and going at it and trying to optimize, right? And sometimes you see that percentage is really low. It's like 0.3% or 0.4%. That typically happens again when the fund is kind of passive. What that means is that the fund has said that, okay, I will just follow an index. I will just follow Nifty 50. So I will just blindly put money wherever, however it's organized in, let's say, an index like the Nifty 50. So a lot of, these things can vary, and do have a look at that. The other important element of cost is the exit load. Now, as I mentioned, right, let's take an FD's example. When you put your money in an FD, and let's say that FD was maturing in 1 year, but you decided to withdraw your funds in, let's say, 6 months, right? Two things will happen to you. First of all, the actual interest rate would change, in the sense that the maturity interest rate of an FD, let's say, was 7%, right? And a lot of people don't actually see this, so you should, it's important. The fixed monthly rate for that same FD might be like 3%. So let's say you decided to break your FD in half a year. Not only would you not get that 6% interest rate, but rather you would get whatever was the 6 monthly rate, like 3.5. There might be, depending on the bank, a breakage charge. So an additional 1% might be, taken away. And exit load is similar to a breakage charge, in the sense that, let's say you put your money in an equity mutual fund and the exit load was 1% for 1 year. What that means is, if you take your money out in less than a year, you're going to be charged 1%, right? But a lot of times, and that's why I gave debt funds as an easy thing to start with. Debt funds, for example, a lot of them may have exit loads of like point something percent for a week, which just means that, as long as you're not withdrawing your money in a week and you're doing it after a week, you have no exit load. A lot of funds, in fact, have 0% exit load, which means that whenever you take out your money, there is nothing like you've taken it out prematurely, and so you don't lose anything. So yeah, these are important elements of cost to keep in mind.
Got it. So again, I'm going to try to summarize this for myself and everyone watching, right? So in terms of channels, there's basically, you're saying there's two main things. There's direct, which means that I'm putting my money directly into the mutual fund, and there is no middle layer in some way, like no person in the middle taking a percentage of the money just for facilitating that transaction. That's direct. Growth could be that maybe I'm using a broker or somebody in the middle who's
regular, not growth. Regular.
Sorry, regular.
That's called regular.
Regular. Okay, that's right. So regular is when there's somebody in the middle, as like a middle layer, kind of facilitating this transaction, and hence they are taking a small percentage of the money that I invest, right? So that's channels. And then in terms of cost, when I invest in a mutual fund, in the moment I may not be charged anything, but there is such a thing, like you said, called expense ratio, which is kind of like the mutual fund saying that just for building this beautiful product for you and investing your money in all these different things, we charge a fee. And this is our fee, which is expense ratio. And then on the other hand, there's something called exit load, which when I leave or I decide to take my money out of the mutual fund, I will be charged, perhaps charged or not charged, a portion of money, depending on what the mutual fund policy is, right? And that is kind of like a withdrawal fee in some ways. Like if you withdraw within X amount of time. Yeah, like a breakage or withdrawal fee. Got it. And any other costs apart from this that we should keep in mind, or this is the...
I mean, the others are like really minor, right? So for example, when you invest on digital platforms, that actual transaction could have like a small, like a 2 rupee, 5 rupee charge, which is literally being paid because you're, you know, like that payment gateway screen that appears. But those are minor things. I think like the important thing that's going to sort of be with you through the life of your investment are these things, the expense ratio and the exit load. So yeah.
Got it. So we have a lot of questions, but before we get into those, one that I had when I started investing is that, you know, when I put in like, let's say 100 rupees, I felt I should get 200 back, and that's growth, right? Like I just felt like maybe it was naive, but for me, it was like if my money is not doubling, right, within a month or whatever, is it really worth it to invest? So I guess the question I have off of that is, when you start investing in equity or debt or whatever, any particular asset class, what is the realistic expectation to have for return? Because I know it's not 100% to 200%. So what is that realistic amount that you should expect when you start investing?
That's a very, very, very good question that everyone should ask themselves before they start. Because again, the world is full of people or tweets that will tell you, oh, I put my money in this, and in 3 months it had become 10x. And just, I mean, yes, sometimes that happens by fluke. That is not a reasonable expectation at all. A few things, right? Like I touched upon the whole inflation concept. The barest of minimum expectations that you need to have from whatever you're investing your money is that you're beating inflation, right? And that is why, like I said, people don't love, I mean, like that's why you're told that hey, your money is lying in your bank account, it's losing value because it's not even beating inflation. So that's the most bare minimum expectation. Now come, you know, all of these other factors of like risk and return and so on and so forth. So let's say because equities or equity mutual funds are considered a little bit riskier, it is fair to assume that if I'm putting my money in that, I should get more return than if I was just putting, let's say, my money in an FD or putting my money in a debt mutual fund or things that are considered safer, right? And again, the value of what that more is or what that percentage is changes over time, and it changes depending on what you're putting your money in, right? So I'll just give a recent example. For example, in the last 1 year, if you look at large cap mutual funds, which, as I said, were really the biggest companies in the country, their stocks put into a mutual fund, you would see, and this would vary fund to fund because it is never exact. Each fund has slightly different composition, different fund managers, so on and so forth. You could see that, you know, it may have returned somewhere around, let's say 20%, right? That's actually, by the way, a lot, right? COVID, a lot of corrections happened and then the market rallied. This is not to say that at any point in history, in 1 year, or in 1 year, you would have got 20%, or at any time in the future, in 1 year, you will get 20%. Like I said, it will really vary from time to time. But let's say in the last 1 year, that's been the case, right? Someone could have invested that same amount of money in a very specific type of fund. Like let's say in only a technology or like a fund that only has international technology stocks, right? Like Facebook, Amazon, Google, you have some of those mutual funds as well. That would have possibly in the last year seen a much higher percentage return simply because those companies did a lot better. That same person, if they were invested in that same fund before COVID hit, would have, by the way, also seen way more loss because those companies were just that much more sensitive, right? And so a realistic expectation is to almost always benchmark this to what you're putting your money in. So, for example, if you're putting your money into, let's say, a large cap mutual fund, a good thing to do, and literally any mutual fund website or any of these platforms. So, like I use something called valueresearch.com because I'm just used to it, but I'm sure that other platforms as well will always tell you that, oh, the sector average. And what that means is broadly, all large cap mutual funds, if you average them, gained, let's say, X% in a year, right? So let's say that percentage was 18%, then it's fair for you to expect that you're investing in a mutual fund. And if that fund gave you, well, 18 or close to 18%, that was probably good. But let's say if the average for that sector, like large cap mutual funds, was like 25%, and your large cap fund just gave you like 18%, then yes, you have reason to be disappointed. And again, this is equity. So let's say you invested in a debt fund, because debt, just by virtue of what it is, right? And all of the things that I explained, that it's almost like in some way it is safer, it is more stable, though again, there are a lot of caveats there, and I don't want to go into too much technicality right now, will normally never give you as much returns as equity, right? So again, in the last 1 year, for example, the typical debt fund return might have been anywhere from like 4% to 9%, right? And so again, the person who was probably getting 4% on their debt fund is reasonable in feeling that, why did I even do this, right? I didn't even beat inflation. That's fair, and that's exactly what you should be thinking of. But let's say you got 9%, which is maybe a little more than what an FD would have given you. That's pretty great. And again, chances are you got 9% because the kind of debt that your fund invested in was just a little bit riskier than the person that got the 3% invested in. But this is how you have to like constantly like temper and set your expectations.
Got it. And since we're talking about mutual funds, something that I want to touch upon is like specifically how to get started, right? So I kind of think of this as an analogy that if I wanted to play football, right? If I don't want to be a pro footballer and I just want to kick a ball around with friends, right? I need to know some basics. I need to know that I need to kick a ball with my feet. I have a goal post, people wearing the same t-shirt as me are in my team, and vice versa, right? So can you tell me, like, what are those 5 or 10 things I need to know before investing in a mutual fund that can allow me to, like, almost under 10 minutes pick a mutual fund, right? I don't need to know everything. There might be like fine prints that a pro investor knows, but I'm just a beginner investor. What are the 5 things I must know before I invest?
Got it. No, super. And I think that's an amazing way to almost like summarize our discussion so far, right? So again, I would split this into things that you should know about yourself and things that you should know about what you're investing in. So things that you should know about yourself, we've already covered, right? How much money are you comfortable starting with? If you're going to like literally need that money 2 months from now, maybe don't invest is because, you sort of need it back and so on and so forth, right? So just think about that, right? Think of an amount that you're comfortable with. Let's say you think that, okay, I want to start with 5,000. And by the way, I also saw someone ask, what's like the smallest amount. Honestly, these days, the amazing thing is that no amount is too small, right? Like there are platforms, and those are some of the apps that I mentioned, that let you start with like as low as, 100 or 500 rupees, right? So really there isn't like too small an amount that you can't start with. So anyways, figure out the amount that you're comfortable with, right? Let's say you figure out that 5,000 rupees is the amount that you're comfortable with, or whatever that is for you. Then again, if you're a beginner, like I just said, see if you're going to be comfortable with this, let's say, small amount of money that you thought of starting with, to take a little bit of risk, but you also don't want to go crazy. Then, like I said, I would just blindly be like large cap mutual fund. And then what will typically happen is that you will see like 50 options. Okay. You will see like Axis Large Cap Mutual Fund, HDFC Large Cap Mutual Fund, Mire, Motilal, so many of them. To be very, very honest, there is no exact science that this AMC makes better mutual funds than this AMC, right? If you actually look at the track record, no one fund has consistently been better in all of time than any other fund. Most funds have ratings, and you see that next to the name, right? Those ratings again don't matter disproportionately, but obviously, like if something is like 1 star or 2 star, don't bother. But 4 star and upwards, pretty safe bet, right? So I would just start with like a large cap equity fund, because that would I would be okay stomaching that risk, right? Or like I said, if you really want to start slow, start with like a debt mutual fund. And again, just don't get overwhelmed by like the 50 names that you see. Just pick something that has a decent rating. Do look at things like expense ratio and exit load. Like I said, right, you might put your money in an equity mutual fund, and that might have a 1 year exit load. And let's say 2 months from now, there is a high chance you might need your money back. Don't invest in that fund, because you are going to get charged that 1% fee. But you could, for example, invest in a debt mutual fund that has 0 exit load, or that has exit load only if you break under a week. I think just with these like 3 or 4 things, if you keep them in mind, you should be good, right? And like I said, this is why it's important to start with a small amount that you're comfortable taking these like baby steps with and learning along the way.
Got it. I'm just going to take a couple of questions from the audience at this stage. I think Siddharth had a question and he wanted to actually come up and ask it. So maybe we can unmute him and he can ask.
Yeah.
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, of course. Hi, Siddharth.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great.
So my question was it's a pretty basic question, but how do you really get conviction around the stocks? Like if you're investing in equity, how do you get conviction around those companies? Like how do you go about doing the research, and how do you really convince yourself that this is the right one to invest in, and you really believe in the growth of that company? Like what are some of those sources and channels that you can have those information, given there is so much information out? So what's the best possible source to have that information?
Got it. That's a really interesting question. I will give you the theoretically correct answer to that, and then I'll give you the realistic answer. The theoretically correct answer to that is, if you want to build conviction around, let's say, a specific company, right? Like you said, there's just way too much information around. You could literally like Google News, you could go to Yahoo Finance, you could go to Value Research, and you would be bombarded with news about that company. That becomes almost like the base level understanding, right? Like, what is this company even doing? Have they been doing well in the last few years? Then this goes into like a lot of smaller things. For example, what sector is this company in, right? So let's say last year when COVID happened and like travel was screwed all around the world, no brainer that the travel sector wasn't doing that well, right? So again, if someone was starting out, they would probably not want to, let's say, start by investing in airlines, because you don't know when people are going to be allowed to travel again, and airline companies were like bleeding money, right? Then you get into more and more minutia by saying, how has that company performed in the last few years, right? What have their earnings been like? Have their earnings beaten expectations? Again, this is a theoretically correct answer, so please bear that in mind. A decently important thing is knowing what's the price earnings multiple. What that basically means is how expensive is that stock compared to how much that company actually earns, right? And typically what happens is, again, let's say for all tech companies, there might be an indication of, as a sector, technology has X price earnings multiple. Theoretically, let's just say that number is 20. So if the company that you're looking at is way higher than that, let's say it's 40 price earnings, it means that it's just way more expensive compared to its earnings than other technology companies, right? So these are all the things a person could look at. And honestly, like I can go on and on and on. There's just so many of them, right? Like there's a beta and whatnot. It's just endless. It could be a whole other section. Most people will not have the time, bandwidth, just brain space to deal with that, right? So a rule of thumb that at least I personally follow, or whenever people tell me, is that even as consumers, right, like there are certain things that we just inherently know, right? So for example, I know that, let's say I use certain products a lot, right? I know, for example, that I use Facebook, right? I know I use Apple, I use all of these things. I'm just a little bit familiar with those companies, right? Or let's say even in an Indian context, right? Let's say I work in tech, right? So I know what Infosys as a company is, right? As a consumer, I know about, for example, Tata's and all of these things. And again, the fact that these are really, really big companies does at the end of the day give you some level of comfort. I'm a customer of HDFC Bank. I see that there is HDFC Bank literally everywhere. Half the people I talk to are customers of HDFC Bank. Clearly, HDFC Bank must be doing something right. A lot of time, all said and done, people make investment decisions based on these very like intuitive things, right? In fact, I'll give you Astha's example here. So Astha was completely new to this. And then a few months back, she's like, hey, I think I should buy CDSL stock. For those of you who don't know, CDSL is like a central depository. So all the stock trading and exchanges and all of these things, they're a very important entity in that ecosystem, right? Her rationale was, all of these apps like Zerodha, Coin, investment apps are doing so well, so much activity is happening in the market. So a company that is a player in that scheme of things is obviously going to do well, right? That was it. That was the analysis. And all said and done, her analysis worked pretty well for her, right? Like she's made pretty good returns. So there are 100 things you can look at, or there is like a much simpler mix of, common sense, relatability, rule of thumb, gut feeling that people can follow. If you're, again, unless you're starting with like insane amounts of money, for most people, that second approach works better simply because it's more doable.
Got it. All right. Thanks.
No worries.
Actually, Aditi, this reminded me of something that I've seen online, which is this advice I read, which I really resonated with, which is just maybe look at your credit card statement and see where you spend money. Like literally just look at where are you putting money, right? And of course, the very obvious stuff will be, okay, I love Maggie. I buy a lot of Maggie. Maybe I can invest in Nestle. That's like the obvious thing. But maybe you just dig a little bit deeper and you say, okay, I travel a lot in an Uber. Maybe there's a car engine manufacturer that particularly will benefit from, me investing in that. So yeah, it just reminded me of that. And I personally really
that's exactly like how that's exactly how that's perfectly the right way to start thinking about this.
Yeah. So I think Bhavna had a question, which was about, is it like deposits with the post office? Does that give you good returns to someone that's a beginner? And I guess deposits in general, we could talk about, right? Like bank deposits versus any other form of investment. What do you think about that?
So, specifically with things like post office or national saving certificates and so on and so forth, these are typically deposits which do end up having, let's say, slightly higher returns than your bank account or your FD and so on and so forth. That is because a lot of the times they also have a lock-in period. And again, like it's really important to know, for example, yes, you could invest in something because it's giving you 2% more interest than something else. But then if it has a lock-in period of, let's say, 5 years, and there is a very high possibility that you will need your money before that, or you don't know for sure right now that you will not need your money in 5 years, right? That's when things get a little bit tricky. But again, like I said, right, if let's say you just get a lot more comfort and security from investing in that than, let's say, investing in a mutual fund or anything else, of course, right? Like that's a good place to start, because again, what will happen, and I've seen this happen with practically everyone that I know, you might start from a place of security, right? Let's say you might start with the post office, deposits with the post office, and you might make your peace with all of those things. As you get a little bit more comfortable, you will become more comfortable experimenting, right? So yes, maybe you may not jump straight into equities, but you might be comfortable, let's say, buying government bonds or mutual funds or so on and so forth. So yeah, by all means start, but please make sure that you know things like, is there a lock-in period? And if you break the lock-in period, what is the breakage penalty and so on and so forth? Exactly the things that you would do when, let's say, you would invest in an FD.
I think actually Akhil asked this question a while back, which was, at what point should you consider getting a portfolio manager for yourself, right? Like, and also, should you consider it? I mean, something I've thought about is like, what if I'm just a person who just doesn't care about all this, right? I come back after a hard day's work and I don't want to think about money and investing. So yeah, maybe your thoughts on that.
I mean, the rule that I've followed, when people have asked me this, or even for myself, is if I have insane amounts of money, yes, for sure. Otherwise, it can be a slippery slope. And let me explain, right? There are a lot of people who are investment advisors and so on and so forth. Like most people have this uncle, or like your parents or friends know this person who's like an advisor, and they'll give you a really nice Excel sheet and so on and so forth. Of course, they put some amount of research into it, right? The point is this though, you're placing a lot of faith in that person's expertise. For example, last year, no one could have anticipated that COVID will happen and markets will lose 25% of their value and they will rebound. So, what I saw a lot of my friends and colleagues go through is that some people's portfolio managers at the beginning of COVID said, "Oh my God, the world is going to end. Take out all your money now." So, even if let's say they were at, they were 10% loss, they were like, it's okay, just, take your money out or put it in something else, right? And then there were certain people who were like, they had different judgments. So the point is, all said and done, even though this industry has made it seem like the experts know everything and everyone else knows nothing, no one can see the future. So it is very likely that your portfolio manager might go wrong, right? Or the advice may not be optimal at all times. That said, again, if as a beginner, as you're starting out, if it's something that helps you start, go for it, right? Like I've had friends who've done that. They were just too scared to just do all of this on their own. And so they started with an advisor. And maybe, within a year, they figured out, oh, you know what, this is simple. I can do this myself. They outgrew it and then they stopped. So the good thing is, if it helps you start, go for it. There's another problem at the other end of the spectrum, where let's say you either you suddenly get a lot of money, right? Like it could be an inheritance, or someone asked something about ESOPs. Like you could suddenly get an exit and get crazy amount of money in ESOPs. So all of a sudden you have this really large pool of money that you have no idea what to do with. That actually might be a good time in your life to, take external help, because it's a special sort of a situation, right? But yeah.
Okay. Akhil, did you have a follow-up? I think you unmuted yourself, so I don't know.
No, that was good. Actually, the second half of the answer was relevant to my question. So thank you. That was really helpful.
Oh, well, congrats. Looks like a good event happened in your life. Yeah.
Got a lot of money.
Yeah.
Perfect. I think another question we got is just like index funds versus equity funds. You touched upon this a little bit, but like managed funds, basically, like something that is actively managed by a fund manager versus index funds. How should we think about this?
No, very, very good question, right? So like I touched upon earlier, index funds are basically very simply the fund or the AMC or the fund manager has decided that I'm just going to blindly follow this index. What's an index? You guys might have heard terms like Sensex and Nifty, or like in the US, for example, S&P, so on and so forth. It's very simply a way of saying that certain stocks are representative of the market, and hence we are going to form an index. So if we say that the Sensex went up 1% today, or the Sensex has been going up like crazy, it generally means that the equity markets have been doing well, right? It doesn't mean that every single stock has been doing well, but it's a broad indication, right? So what index funds do is that they say, okay, you know what? We're not going to do any rocket science. We're not going to sit and like go crazy and overanalyze these things. We're going to blindly follow the index. So for example, if the Nifty 50, which has 50 stocks, has certain allocation of certain stocks, right? Say HDFC Bank is X%, Infosys is Y%, so on and so forth. I'm going to replicate the exact same structure, and that's it. That's all I'm going to do. That is called passive management, because no human being is sitting and bringing it every day on like, how do I beat the market? You're not trying to beat the market. Your assumption is that over a large period of time, because the economy will do well, so on and so forth, so generally the index will go up. So if I just invest in those exact same things, by default, I will do well, right? Typically, these are funds that will have very low expense ratios, because again, right, like I said, you're basically just following an index, and the expectation is not that you will beat the market. So in any given year, for example, if the index, let's say it was following the Nifty 50, went up by, let's say, 10%, then really the realistic expectation is that the value of your investment in your fund would have also appreciated by roughly the same amount, slightly lower, slightly higher, but broadly the same amount, right? Index funds are a type of equity mutual funds. There are a lot of other equity mutual funds, right? Almost the stark opposite of this are funds which are very, very actively managed. So there are funds that claim that we will beat the market because we have the best strategies and we do a lot of research and we have these amazing fund managers. And there again, the expectation is that if on an average the industry or the market went up like 10%, because you promised to beat the market because you're so amazing, you would have definitely got me more than 10% returns, right? Again, these will be funds that will also have a higher expense ratio. So like it could be as high as 2%, whereas for an index fund, it could literally be like 0.25%. So this is the broad distinction.
Got it. So I think I'm going to just ask you two last questions, which is, one is that, something I think a lot of us hear is this whole thing that time in the market is better than timing the market. What does that even mean? And how should we, maybe take something actionable away from that for us as beginner investors, right? Doing this for the first time.
So I think, this whole time in the market is more important than timing. Again, it's not a fundamentally wrong thing to say, but it does need a little bit more nuance. Because a lot of times retail investors, right? Like a question that we were asked earlier, what are the things that you should think about when investing in a stock? Who has time to do all of those things, right? So if retail investors, let's say, get into the trap of like trying to do all of that and over-engineer the process, that might just not be ideal, right? So a general sort of advice that the industry came up with is, put money in something and forget about it, right? And 10 years later, you would have got amazing gains, or 20 years, 30 years later, you would have got amazing gains, right? That's what people mean when they say time in the market is better than timing the market. Timing the market means that every single day or every single week, you're like checking, oh, has there been a correction? Is the market like 2% down today? Maybe I should invest today, as opposed to like, tomorrow when it might not be 2% down, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Broadly, yes, that is correct. That is correct. As normal individuals who have, lives and jobs and other things to worry about, it is really frustrating to try and like time the market. That said, the opposite of it, right, which is like put your money and forget about it, also doesn't hold true for everyone. For starters, the person saying, oh, invest in, I don't know, XYZ stock today, and just 20 years later, you'll be amazingly rich, is assuming that you will be able to stay invested for 20 years. That person's assuming that nothing will happen in your life. There'll be no sudden emergency. There'll be no sudden need to like take your money out, right? That may not be true for everyone. Again, I'm taking COVID as an example, but let's say last year, when in 1 month, the Nifty and the Sensex lost 25% of their value, which means, let's say, broadly, you had invested 100 rupees, 25 was just wiped out in 1 month. If someone had, for whatever reason, if someone needed their money at that time, right? Like something bad happened to them, someone got sick and they needed that money, they would have had to stomach that loss. So it's not a blind rule to follow that, put your money and forget about it. And a healthy pattern that I've seen a lot of like good investors develop is from time to time, you keep seeing how your investments are doing and you do something called trimming. Trimming just means that, let's say you invested 10,000 rupees, right? And over a period of 3 years, you see that that's become like, I don't know, 17,000 rupees. Maybe you sell a small portion of it so that that profit actually becomes yours, like you realize that profit, and maybe you reinvest more, right? So time to time, keep doing things like that. A lot of people, in fact, trim when other life events happen. So for example, you want to buy a car, you want to buy a house. Honestly, sometimes it could be something else, right? Like you've had a really tough year and you really just, want to go on a holiday, and the value of that holiday is just disproportionately important to your mental health. Sure, that's why we earn money. That's why we save, right? Trim a little bit and take it away. And of course, later on reinvest it. So yeah, I think that's a healthier approach than saying, put your money and forget about it and don't look at it.
Got it. I think we're already over time. So just one last question for you is that, as you start to learn about this stuff, you learn about mutual funds, you learn about stocks, there's just always something more. Like if you do MS, there's stocks, you do stocks, there's crypto, there's derivatives. And I mean, I don't even know what some of these words mean, right? So like, where does it end? Like, do you just kind of keep doing more, or is there like a balance that you find somehow? Like for someone that's beginning, it can be really, really intimidating that the more you learn, the more you do that, the more there is to know. So how do you find that balance for yourself as a early beginner investor?
You're absolutely right, by the way. This is intimidating to the best of us. So, like, I feel so shit that I don't invest in cryptocurrencies. And I know there was a question on that. The reason I don't invest in cryptocurrencies, again, is same problem. I know a lot, like I know a lot about that industry. So in my mind, I'm always thinking of, oh, this is why they're overvalued and this is what could go wrong. And I know so many people who just like took a hunch and they were like, okay, yeah, let's invest in Bitcoin. Let's see what happens, right? This is the, let's say they pick a certain amount of money that I think I could just forget about this and they invest. And you know what? Maybe they're way smarter. Maybe they'll do better. It never ends. And the best of us feel intimidated and you always feel FOMO, like, oh my God, I'm not doing this. The only thing I can tell you is everyone feels like that. It is the most important thing. Like if you can take one thing away from this is to just start with something. If mutual funds are, let's say, what you understood based on today's discussion, or stocks or whatever, or post office saving deposits, right? Just start there. Don't not start because you're intimidated by, oh my God, there are 10 things and I must know about all 10 things before I start. And one thing I can guarantee is you will learn as you go. Like you will talk to people, read things, or if anything else, you'll get less intimidated and you'll feel less scared Googling some of this stuff and like you learn. But yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I want to share something quickly based off of that is that like recently I realized during COVID, I was feeling this like massive pressure because of this hustle culture, right? Where everyone's like, oh, I've got so many returns and these many like gains and you must also do crypto and all. And I actually think I overdid it for a little bit where I invested more than maybe I should have. And only this month actually paused a couple of SIPs for a bit because I realized that this isn't serving me well in my life. I'm cutting back on things that I actually care about to keep investing this money because I feel like there's some crazy end goal I need to reach. But ultimately, like I'm not happy. I'm feeling restricted. I'm not feeling like the things I wanted to do with money are happening. Holistically, I'm unhappy. Even though I'm saving more, even though I'm investing more and I'm doing the right things, I'm actually unhappy. So I feel like there's a balance that has to be struck and maybe people sometimes lose sight of that. And I think I've become more conscious over time of not doing that. So yeah.
I think that's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, look, there were a lot of questions in chat and unfortunately we haven't been able to answer that. We're already over time.
We're sorry.
Yeah, we're really sorry, but we do have another investing masterclass coming up in 2 weeks, and we will try to answer all of your questions in that, right? So thank you for joining us today. Before we leave, I think Aditi, I just wanted to ask you: is there a closing thought you want to leave people with? Because we went through a lot today, right? We talked about mutual funds a little bit. We jumped into stocks. There was a lot that we covered. So is there a closing thought you want to leave everyone that attended this with?
I think, yeah, I mean, not to sound like a broken record, but starting is way more important than not starting or starting perfectly. Also, in case it wasn't painfully obvious, of course, like for example, even today we covered a lot, right? Everything that I'm saying maybe so effortlessly comes after like having done so many wrong things and made so many mistakes and so on and so forth. So if at all today's session intimidated you a little bit, or you didn't find it useful, or you think that you need to know way more and so on and so forth, don't worry. Everyone goes through this. Like I said, I feel terrible because I don't invest in cryptocurrencies. The trick is to just be at it, right? To just be a little bit disciplined, to start having these conversations. Trust me, it matters way more than you think. I know we didn't touch upon some of the really tricky scenarios today, right? Like what happens when that bad thing does happen? Like you are invested and something really terrible happened and you need your money. Like what should you do? We didn't touch upon those tricky situations. Honestly, there are no easy answers there. We will try our best to touch upon them in our next situation and, talk about more like actionable things, real life examples. Today was meant to honestly just set a base for people, right? Without making it like a chalk and blackboard kind of session. But yeah, really, really appreciated that, you guys gave us so much of your time. It was a pleasure to be here.
I think actually a thought that just popped in my mind, I just really want to share this, is that I think that when all of us were kids, we thought of money with this great amount of joy, right? Like we all got that like one envelope of cash on Diwali or Christmas from our relatives, and we had to play that game of, no, I don't want it because my mom said I shouldn't want it, but we did want it. And there was this like joy and naughtiness and happiness associated with that money, because I remember all I ever bought was like chips and a 5 rupee Kit Kat, right? So having 200 rupees was like, oh my God, the possibilities are endless. What can I do with this money? And I think if anything, we should maybe all start approaching investing just a little bit that way, where you think of it not as like this heavy, daunting thing we have to do, but maybe just like try to channel some of that joy you felt as a kid where, you know, the possibilities are so many. What am I going to do? Am I going to buy 20 Kit Kats? So like, what can I do with this money? I don't know, but it's exciting. And I feel like maybe if anything, we should take that away from this session. And again, I know there was a lot that we didn't cover, so we can take this conversation offline, right? So talk to us, write to us on Instagram at MySaltApp and at Sipping Thoughts. We would love to answer any questions you guys have, and we will try to cover more of the specifics, right? Like the specific tips and tricks of actionable stuff you can do in our next session, which is in 2 weeks. Thanks again for joining us.